Emergency Relief Program Overview: Applying for Emergency Road and Highway Repair Funding. Welcome to the Emergency Relief Program Overview, or how to begin the application process for emergency road and highway repair funding. Here's why MnDOT is sharing this information with you. No one can control Mother Nature. When she unleashes her floods, tornadoes, or straight-line winds on Minnesota roads and highways, we need help, and as soon as we can get it. This video introduces you to where emergency funding comes from to fix highway and road damage and how to start the process for getting it. Introduction. This course introduces MnDOT's agreement with the Federal Highway Administration, known as the Emergency Relief Programmatic Agreement, or ERPA. It also identifies 4 sources for possible emergency relief funding. Next, the video shows the process to follow to apply for funding for emergency road and highway repairs after natural disasters. Finally, it lists the specific parts of a right-of-way that may be repaired with FHWA emergency relief funds. The Emergency Relief Programmatic Agreement is covered next. How ERPA defines reimbursable work. The ER Programmatic Agreement between MnDOT and FHWA defines emergency restoration work as work necessary to reopen roadways to traffic, minimize damage already caused, prevent further damage to the roadway. According to ERPA, FHWA emergency restoration work is reimbursable at 100%. FHWA permanent repair work is reimbursable at 80%. Emergency relief players. When disasters strike, these are the organizations that will coordinate efforts and/or reimburse road and highway repairs and recovery costs. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, whose mission is to help people before, during, and after disasters, both natural and man-made. It coordinates all government relief effort and is broken into 10 regions. Minnesota is in FEMA Region 5. In 2003, FEMA became a part of Homeland Security. The highest amount of emergency relief funding for the state as a whole potentially comes from FEMA. Debris, emergency protective measures like sandbagging, and uninsured damage to buildings fall under the FEMA Public Assistance and State Disaster Fund programs. The Federal Highway Administration, according to its mission, provides stewardship over the construction, maintenance, and preservation of the nation's highways, bridges, and tunnels. FEMA and FHWA have an agreement on who pays to restore different kinds of roads after a disaster. Roadways with a functional classification of major collectors and above are FHWA's responsibility. So, damage to major collectors and above road types is not eligible for relief funding from FEMA or the State Disaster Fund. Instead, they are eligible for FHWA emergency relief. Minnesota Homeland Security Emergency Management is part of the Department of Public Safety. The division coordinates the statewide disaster efforts and recovery process. That is, they coordinate FEMA and State Disaster Relief Fund reimbursements. The State Disaster Relief Fund originates from the state legislation for emergency management. The governor invokes Chapter 12B of it to supply state funds for recovery from natural disasters. 2 MnDOT departments are also involved in emergency relief for roads, bridges, and highways: State Aid for Local Transportation, SALT, and MnDOT Emergency Management, EM. SALT works directly with county and city engineers. Emergency Management deals directly with MnDOT districts and coordinates damage assessment and disaster processes. They help coordinate recovery efforts. The Emergency Relief Programmatic Agreement between FHWA and MnDOT defines deadlines and reimbursable amounts for required FHWA emergency relief funds. Possible funding source. When a natural disaster damages roads and highways, there are 4 possible sources for emergency relief funding. To recap, emergency relief funds may come from 1. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, 2. Minnesota State Disaster Fund, which is coordinated by HSEM, 3. The Federal Highway Administration, or 4. The State Aid Disaster Account. Where your funding actually comes from will depend on the estimated cost of repairing the damage and the type of damage. Those estimated costs must come from your organization. Once estimated costs are collected, each county must declare a county emergency. This is a requirement to be eligible for emergency relief reimbursement. Possible funding source: FEMA. To be eligible for FEMA emergency funding, 1. The county requests a preliminary damage assessment, PDA, from Minnesota Homeland Security Emergency Management, HSEM Department. 2. MnDOT and local public agency, LPA, employees check road and highway infrastructures, estimate damage, and turn that into a MnDOT EM. 3. MnDOT reports its estimates to the LPA where the affected roadways are. This contributes to the county's overall damage indicator threshold. 4. MnDOT EM calculates MnDOT's total damage. They share this information with Minnesota HSEM and the County Emergency Management Department. 5. If the estimate meets or exceeds the county's damage indicator threshold, the county declares a county emergency. This is required before a county can be eligible for any disaster relief funding. County damage indicator thresholds vary from county to county because they're based on population. 6. Minnesota HSEM conducts their preliminary damage assessment. 7. Once that's done and Minnesota HSEM has identified all the counties affected, Minnesota HSEM drafts an emergency order for the governor. 8. The governor issues the emergency order that lists all affected counties, requesting a FEMA preliminary damage assessment. 9. FEMA arrives and inspects. If FEMA verifies the damage is equal to or over the statewide damage threshold for the federal fiscal year, the request goes up the FEMA chain of command. 10. FEMA Region 5 reviews the request, approves it, and moves on. 11. Then FEMA HQ reviews, and if passed, 12. They recommend that the president declare the combined sites as a disaster area. 13. The president signs a declaration making Minnesota eligible for FEMA's public assistance funds. That's the application process for FEMA funding. Next is the state disaster relief. Possible funding source: State Disaster Fund. The procedure for applying for the State Disaster Fund follows several of the same steps completed for FEMA. 1. The county requests a preliminary damage assessment, PDA, from HSEM. 2. MnDOT and local public agency, LPA, employees check road and highway infrastructures and estimate damage. 3. MnDOT reports their estimates to each LPA where damaged roads are. 4. MnDOT EM calculates MnDOT's total damage costs and shares it with Minnesota HSEM. 5. The county declares a county emergency. This is required before a county can be eligible for any disaster relief funding. For state disaster relief funds, the threshold is half the FEMA threshold. 6. Minnesota HSEM conducts their PDA. 7. Once assessments are collected, Minnesota HSEM prepares the Chapter 12B declaration. 8. Minnesota HSEM visits public agencies that reported damage and creates project worksheets for the repairs. 9. MnDOT EM monitors progress of ER process and serves as a point of contact for HSEM. Counties go through their county disaster manager. 10. Districts and counties submit final paperwork. 11. HSEM reimburses them. That completes the application process for state disaster funding. Up next is the process for FHWA. Possible funding source: FHWA. Damage to major collectors and above may be eligible for FHWA emergency relief. Here's the process for applying for FHWA funding. The first few steps will sound familiar. 1. The county requests a preliminary damage assessment from HSEM. 2. MnDOT and LPA employees check road and highway infrastructures, estimate damage, and report it. 3. MnDOT EM calculates MnDOT's damage. They share this information with Minnesota HSEM. 4. The county declares a county emergency. This is required before a county can be eligible for any emergency relief funding. 5. Minnesota HSEM conducts their PDA. 6. Minnesota HSEM drafts an emergency order for the governor. 7. The governor issues an emergency order. If the governor does not issue an emergency order, FHWA emergency relief funds are unavailable. 8. If damage is over $700,000 to major collectors and above, then MnDOT EM submits a letter of intent to FHWA. 9. MnDOT districts and counties create detailed damage inspection reports, or DDIRs. 10. For any site with damage over $150,000 or unusual damage identified, districts and counties request site visits from FHWA. 11. FHWA conducts site inspections. 12. FHWA reviews DDIRs and, after a review and update process, signs them. 13. Districts and counties begin the authorization process. Possible funding source: State Aid Disaster Account. The State Aid Disaster Account is used when a county or urban municipality has an emergency or damage estimate that exceeds 10% of the current road annual state aid allotment to the affected county or urban municipality. Only roadways on the County State Aid Highway, CSA, or Municipal State Aid Street, MSAS, systems are eligible. The process works like this. 1. The appropriate engineer completes the affected roadway's emergency repair estimate. 2. They submit it to the Area MnDOT District State Aid Engineer, DSAE, along with Disaster Board Request Letter. 3. Any county desiring aid by reason of disaster must request such aid in writing, after which the Commissioner will appoint a disaster board consisting of 2 county engineers or county commissioners from other counties, if possible, counties from outside the district and disaster event area, and 1 representative of the Commissioner. 4. This board investigates the matter and reports its findings and recommendations in writing to the Commissioner. 5. If approved, the affected body proceeds with construction. They may request funds up front. 6. After construction is complete, the county or urban municipality submits a request for reimbursement to state aid and their finance group. Repairs eligible for ER funding. Part of LPA and MnDOT's responsibilities when applying for emergency relief funding are estimating costs. ERPA lists those items which may be included in preliminary estimates and then later in detailed damage inspection reports, DDIRs. According to the FHWA Emergency Relief Manual, page 3, this is what can be repaired with FHWA federal funds. All elements within the cross-section of a highway that are damaged as a direct result of disaster are eligible for repair under the ER program. This includes, but is not limited to, pavement, shoulders, slopes and embankments, guardrails, signs and traffic control devices, bridges, culverts, cribbing or other bank control features, bike and pedestrian paths, fencing and retaining walls. The repair of a pedestrian or bicycle trail inside the right-of-way of a federal aid highway is eligible for ER funding whether or not the roadway itself is damaged. Summary. The purpose of this video was to acquaint you with the agreement between MnDOT and FHWA, ERPA, which defines the emergency recovery roadwork that is reimbursable. Explain 4 sources of potential emergency relief funding for road repair and their requirements, walk through the application process for each, and share the road elements that can be repaired with federal funds. The next step should be identifying the site and preparing a preliminary damage estimate, the next video in this series. Thank you for watching.